That quote may sound like a challenge, but it's also a confession that reason has limits and that faith doesn't begin where logic leads, it begins where logic stops. This question, can logic lead to faith, has been tossed around for centuries, but not always honestly. Most of the time, it's not really a question. It's a prelude, a way to make belief feel justified to those who already believe, a way to retrofit logic onto something that was never built on it to begin with. And yet, the question still deserves real attention, because if logic could lead to faith, not just justify it after the fact, then belief would be something we could arrive at through careful reasoning, something like math or science. But that's not what faith is, and deep down, most people know it. Think about what logic is. It's not just being clever. Logic is structure. It's the rules of thought, the mental scaffolding that helps us avoid contradictions, spot falsehoods, and build solid conclusions from evidence. And logic doesn't care how something makes you feel. It doesn't care how many people believe it, and it definitely doesn't bend just to preserve tradition or comfort. But faith, religious faith especially, lives in a very different neighborhood. Faith, by definition, doesn't require evidence. That's what makes it faith. It fills the space between what you know and what you want to be true, and it asks you to step across that gap, not with evidence but with trust, hope, or fear. Now, some will say that faith and reason don't have to be at odds, that they can coexist, even support each other. And that might sound nice, but when you press into the details, things get shaky fast. Let's take one of the most common claims, that the universe is so finely tuned, so orderly and complex, that it must have been designed by an intelligent mind. It sounds logical on the surface, but it's not actually a conclusion of logic. It's a leap from observation to explanation, without a mechanism, without a process, without any evidence that connects the dots. It's a classic example of what's called the God of the gaps, filling in what we don't yet understand with a divine placeholder. And the moment we learn more, that placeholder gets smaller. Think of how much ground religion used to cover that's now handled by science. Disease was once a punishment from God, now it's viruses and bacteria. Thunder was the anger of the gods, now it's atmospheric pressure and electrical charge. The more we understand, the less we need to invoke something supernatural. So the question becomes, is there any part of belief that still holds up purely through logic, without falling back on emotion or tradition? Apologists often turn to arguments that sound logical but fall apart under scrutiny, like the cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And that cause must be God. But even that has cracks. First, we don't know that everything begins to exist. Quantum mechanics complicates that. Second, we have no experience of a universe beginning, so applying everyday logic to cosmic origins is already a stretch. And third, even if there were a cause, jumping from cause to personal God is a leap of pure imagination. These arguments don't start with curiosity, they start with a conclusion and then work backward. It's like solving a maze from the end instead of the beginning. Sure, you'll find a path, but it won't be honest and it won't be replicable. Anyone can reverse engineer logic to support something they already want to believe, but that's not reason, that's rationalization. And it's worth pausing here, because rationalization is where a lot of people get trapped. When you really want something to be true, maybe because it's comforting or it's part of your identity, or your whole community depends on it, you'll unconsciously look for reasons to defend it. Not test it, defend it. And your mind will obligingly hand them over. It feels like thinking, but it's not. It's just constructing a mental fortress around an idea that can't stand on its own. This is why some of the smartest people still believe things that don't make sense. Intelligence doesn't immunize you against belief. In fact, it can make the walls of your faith even stronger, because you're better at defending them. But logic isn't about defense. It's about discovery. Let's turn this around. is there anything about religious belief that logic actually contradicts? Yes, a law. Take miracles. By definition, a miracle breaks the laws of nature. That's the whole point. But logic, the kind that builds bridges, powers computers, cures disease, is grounded in consistency. If logic is real, miracles aren't. And if miracles are real, logic breaks down. You can't have both without gutting one of them. Then there's the concept of eternal reward and punishment, heaven and hell. It might sound morally satisfying, justice in the next life to make up for the lack of it in this one, but let's apply logic to it. An infinite punishment for finite crimes? That's not justice. That's eternal torment for temporary mistakes. It doesn't add up, not morally, not philosophically, not mathematically. And yet, people cling to these ideas, not because of logic, but because they serve a function. They help explain suffering, provide comfort in grief, offer hope when life feels pointless. Those are real needs, deep human needs. But logic doesn't serve emotion. It tests it. Some argue that logic can lead you to the need for faith, that when you strip away all the answers, all the certainties, you're left with a hole, and belief is what fills it. But that's not logic leading to faith. That's logic highlighting the absence of meaning and faith rushing in to patch it. It's a psychological response, not a rational one. Now that doesn't mean it's weak. Humans are wired to seek meaning, to look for patterns, to find comfort in stories. But that wiring isn't proof that the stories are true. It just means they're appealing. Belief can be compelling without being coherent. And maybe this is the core issue. Logic is about truth, what is. Faith is about meaning, what we want to be. They're not on the same path. They don't even move in the same direction. You don't reason your way into belief. You choose to believe despite reason, or outside of it. Even religious thinkers admit this. Kierkegaard called it a leap of faith, not a stroll of evidence, not a climb up a logical staircase, a leap. Because faith requires you to leave reason behind. So can logic lead to faith? Only if you redefine one of those words. You can use logic to build a case for why belief is comforting. You can use it to understand the psychological benefits of religion, the social structures it supports, the role it plays in history and morality. But none of that makes the belief true. It just explains why people want it to be. Truth doesn't care what you want, logic doesn't either. And if you follow logic honestly, if you trace it without bias, without emotional pressure, it leads somewhere. But it doesn't lead to faith. It leads to questions, to humility, to not knowing. And that, ironically, is what many people fear more than anything. Not hell, not judgment, just uncertainty. But maybe that's where freedom starts. Because if you can sit with uncertainty, if you can look at the vastness of the universe and say, I don't know, without rushing to fill the silence, then you're actually doing something extraordinary. You're being honest. And that honesty, that intellectual humility, is the very thing that faith often discourages. Not always, but often. Because faith tends to reward certainty. It praises those who are sure, not those who are still thinking, still questioning, still doubting. But doubt is not a weakness. Doubt is the beginning of knowledge. Socrates said, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. And that's not just a philosophical soundbite. It's a way of living, a way of staying open, a way of refusing to settle for easy answers just because they feel good. Now let's bring in another layer. What happens when people try to use logic to defend faith in public spaces? In schools, in politics, in law? It almost always leads to confusion or conflict. Because the moment you try to justify belief with logic, it becomes vulnerable to the same standards you're appealing to. It invites examination, and faith doesn't do well under a microscope. You'll hear things like moral law proves a moral lawgiver, but does it? Morality can emerge from culture, empathy, survival instincts, and it evolves. We don't burn witches anymore. That didn't happen because God changed. It happened because we did. Or take design implies a designer. If that's true, then who designed the designer? And if the answer is no one, the designer just exists, then you've broken your own rule. You've made a special exception for your belief, which isn't logic, it's a loophole. These arguments don't convince non-believers. They're not meant to. They're often used to reassure the already convinced. They're intellectual window dressing, not real inquiry. But that doesn't mean everyone using them is dishonest. Most people genuinely believe their faith is rational. And it feels that way because they're surrounded by a community that reinforces it, by traditions that repeat it, by experiences that seem to validate it. And here's the thing, the human mind is incredibly good at making patterns, seeing what it wants to see, feeling certainty where there isn't any. If you've ever thought your phone vibrated but it didn't, that's your brain expecting a signal. Same with belief. Once the framework is in place, everything starts to fit the story. That's not a failure of intelligence, it's just how we're built. But it does mean we need to be cautious, especially when belief starts to shape real-world decisions, medical ones, legal ones, educational ones. If you believe something because it feels right, and you use it to influence others, you owe it to them and to yourself to make sure it's not just wishful thinking with a logical mask. Because faith can be used to justify anything, and it often is. It's been used to defend war, oppression, inequality, and blind obedience, all in the name of something unseen, untested, untouchable by reason. And that should concern us, because if logic can't question faith, then faith is above reason. And if something is above reason, then it's immune to criticism, immune to evidence, immune to change. That's not just intellectually dangerous, it's socially dangerous. But what if, someone might ask, faith isn't about argument? What if it's just personal, just spiritual? Can't logic leave that alone? Sure, but then it's not logic leading to faith, it's faith standing apart from logic, which is fine as long as it stays there. The problem begins when faith wants the credibility of logic without the accountability. If you claim your belief is beyond reason, that's honest. If you claim it is supported by reason, that's a claim we're allowed to test. And when we do, the results tend to fall short. Not because believers are bad thinkers, but because belief isn't based on thinking in the first place. It's based on need, on identity, on upbringing, on community, all of which are powerful forces, but none of which are arguments. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can accept that some people will always prefer certainty to truth, that they'll lean on belief not because it makes sense, but because it gives them something they feel they can't live without. Or we can stay with the discomfort of not knowing, of not filling the silence, of asking again and again, what's real, and what's just the echo of our hopes? And that's hard, because we are story-driven creatures. We crave narratives that make sense of the chaos. And religion offers one, with beginnings and endings, rewards and punishments, heroes and villains. But logic doesn't offer closure, it offers clarity. It doesn't comfort, it confronts. It strips away what feels good in order to leave what's real. And maybe that's why it will never be a popular road to walk. Faith is wide, logic is narrow. Faith is fast, logic is slow. Faith promises answers, logic keeps asking questions. But here's the upside. When you stop needing the answers to come from outside you, when you let go of the need for cosmic reassurance, you gain something deeper. Not just intellectual freedom, but emotional honesty. You stop pretending. You stop forcing the puzzle to fit. You accept the mystery not because you gave up, but because you're done lying to yourself. There's no final reward for that, no heaven, no divine applause. But there is something. There's the quiet strength of standing on your own 2 feet, of not outsourcing your understanding of the universe to a story that asks you to shut your eyes and call it sight. So can logic lead to faith? But it can lead to something better. It can lead to truth, even when it's hard. It can lead to integrity, even when it's lonely. And it can lead to freedom, the kind that doesn't need permission from a higher power to think, question, or grow. That's the kind of journey logic offers. And for some of us, it's the only one worth taking. And even though it's not always an easy path, the rewards aren't imaginary. When you build your worldview on evidence, reason, and curiosity, you don't need to be afraid of new information. You don't have to protect your beliefs from change. You don't have to bend logic to keep something sacred. You can let go of the fear that you'll lose something essential if you stop believing. Because what you gain is something more honest, more resilient, a kind of inner stability that doesn't rely on external validation or divine approval. You stop living in a mental loop of defending the same answers, and you start living in the open space of better questions. And questions are powerful. They lead us forward, they break old habits, they keep our minds alive. Questions are what pull us out of inherited thinking and into something we've actually examined, something we've earned. Now that doesn't mean you have to become cold or mechanical. Logic isn't the enemy of meaning. It just makes sure that meaning isn't built on illusions. You can still feel awe, still feel gratitude, still find beauty in existence. You just don't need a supernatural scaffolding to hold it all together. You don't need invisible forces to justify your sense of wonder. The world is strange and beautiful enough as it is, without adding myths to make it feel complete. And maybe that's the most liberating part. You don't need faith to have a full life. You don't need sacred texts to know how to treat others. You don't need to believe in unseen beings to experience love, morality, purpose, or connection. All of those things exist right here in the messy, flawed, finite world we actually live in. And when you stop waiting for some cosmic plan, you start making your own. You stop outsourcing responsibility. You stop hoping that someone else is keeping score. You start realizing that what you do now matters now. Not because a God says so, but because you say so, because people around you feel the impact of your choices, because you'll be remembered by what you build, not what you believed. That's a heavy thought, but it's also empowering. You get one life, one brief window of consciousness in a universe that doesn't owe you answers. And in that life, you can choose honesty over comfort, clarity over illusion, integrity over certainty. It doesn't come with promises, it doesn't promise heaven, but it does offer something real. The ability to look at yourself in the mirror and know you didn't lie to yourself just to feel better. That's something not everyone can say. So no, logic doesn't lead to faith. It leads to doubt, to awareness, to the kind of understanding that never closes the book, never stops evolving, never puts a period where there should be a question mark. And maybe that's what makes it sacred in its own way. Not because it gives us all the answers, but because it gives us the courage to live without them. That's a different kind of strength, a quiet one. But sometimes the quietest truths are the ones that echo the longest. And maybe that's the real beauty of logic. It doesn't beg for certainty. It doesn't force a conclusion just to soothe the mind. It teaches you how to live with complexity, how to stay steady in the presence of the unknown. It doesn't demand belief and invites understanding. And once you've experienced that shift from needing to believe to wanting to know, something changes in you. You start to notice how often people confuse familiarity with truth, how often they mistake repetition for evidence, how often faith gets passed down like an heirloom, not because it's been examined, but because it's been inherited. And you realize that kind of belief isn't chosen. It's absorbed. But when you step back and start thinking for yourself, not as a rebel, not to be difficult, just honestly, it's like finally walking outside after years in a crowded room. Things feel lighter, quieter, clearer, and you begin to see that the world, even without a divine blueprint, is still profoundly meaningful. Not because it was designed to be, but because we're capable of giving it meaning ourselves. That's not a small thing. That's not a consolation prize. That's real agency. You become responsible for what you believe, not because someone commands it, but because you've decided it matters. That shift from imposed belief to earned understanding is what separates faith from thought. It's what turns passive acceptance into active awareness. And when more people start living that way, asking better questions, demanding better evidence, being honest with what they know and what they don't, then we move forward. Together, not as tribes defending old stories, but as minds learning to live in an uncertain world with open eyes. And that's what logic offers. Not finality, not peace, not a warm blanket to sleep under, but a compass, a way to navigate a life that doesn't come with a map. And once you start moving that way, you stop needing the map, because the journey itself becomes the point.